So, welcome to another episode of ThootoTalks. I am your host, Teja Sefoka, and today we'll be discussing the new Employment Equity Amendment Act. And I'm joined by none other than the expert, Khethiwe Nkuna. How are you doing this morning?
I'm good, thanks, and you, Teja?
I am fantastic. So, you've been a part of skills development initiatives that have impacted the lives of over 92,000 individuals. Beyond just looking at the numbers, what did meaningful transformation look like in those moments?
So I think for me, if we really drill down in terms of meaningful transformation, it's really drilling down to the individual.
Okay.
It's drilling down to a lasting impact on an individual's life, and even myself, I have been a recipient of people investing in me and putting love and investment and development into my own development. So that is truly what it's about. It's about having quality programs in place that do have a lasting impact in people's lives. It's really saying, how do I use this legislative framework and the programs in terms of the skills development learnerships to create lasting change in someone's life?
They have a lasting impact.
Absolutely. And some of those small examples would include, for example, a learnership for a person with a disability, where that person would have been locked out of opportunities, would have been at home because they didn't get an opportunity to go to university because they probably don't have a matric that would enable them to go to university. But even through those challenges, skills programs and the learnerships, if there is quality embedded into it, it does actually result in people actually creating long-term sustainable careers. And I've experienced a number of young people with disabilities who had never even touched a computer in their life. Okay. And when they actually go through the program and given the opportunity and them also committing to the opportunity, they become software developers after 3 years.
So it's like a two-way stream. It involves, agency from yourself and also investment externally.
100%, 100%. I think the biggest part probably being the individual taking up the opportunity, where this is an opportunity that you're given. And it's such an interesting space as well, because I think within the disability space as well, there's so many nuances and complexities where you find some of these young people are moonlighting. You find some of these young people, and it's because the stipend is maybe too small that they then go for other opportunities. The dropout rates are high, but if the program is structured from the onset to say, we want to have the best outcome from this program and invest in these young people, and maybe let's put our stipend a little bit higher.
And we like
Exactly.
Yeah.
Let's have other components in terms of workplace integration that is embedded beyond just the technical part. The big part then from the individual and the young person that is on the program is the commitment to actually run with this investment that will have a transformative change in your life. So the examples of the young person that I'm speaking about, I remember his name. His name was Ishmael. He had never touched a computer before. And by the end of the 3-year program, was speaking fluently in terms of the fourth industrial revolution. That's what transformative change is about.
More completely. So you're saying the example of Ishmael is basically like a blueprint as to what's supposed to happen. Ishmael taking the incentive to actually, improve on his own while getting the external financial, implementation within him completely. So moving on to, the Employment Equity Amendment Act, what do you think the most significant changes are?
We are actually living in very exciting times, I think. So we've all been waiting with bated breath for the sectoral targets, and they were actually published on the 15th of April. And these sectoral targets really bring, I think, significant change, right? Because what's now apparent is companies have got 5 years to put in place a 5-year employment equity plan. And that employment equity plan, they then need to measure year on year and report back to the Department of Labor in terms of the progress that they are making. If they do not meet the targets for each of the years, what is then going to happen is they're not going to get a certificate of compliance. The consequence of not having the certificate of compliance is actually that you can't do business with government. And some of the guidelines and templates and changes that have been affected, include, for example, an opportunity for you to report. And if you have not met, there are justifiable reasons, which you then need to document in terms of your EEA50. And the justifiable reasons would include, for example, low, tough business times where the business is not growing and you've got limited recruitment opportunities. It would include maybe things like acquisitions and mergers. It would also include elements around ensuring that, you are addressing holistically in terms of, the gaps. The biggest change, I think, also being documenting the importance of keeping the relevant documentation that I have not met my plan, but my intention is there, and I've put in place programs to develop talent. You can't, for example, say I've not met my EE plan because I can't find African talent to hire.
Would you have to, in that situation, just like show, how would you then show that you actually tried as opposed to just like saying that you didn't, reach that target?
So it's documented, one, in your analysis, right? When you put together the EA12, that is your detailed analysis, together with your plan. The plan has got clear action steps that you put in place for 5 years, including any affirmative action barriers. You identify those affirmative action barriers and how you're going to be closing out those affirmative action barriers. So it could be, for example, a barrier that you identify is lack of representation in terms of the interview panels.
Okay, tell me more about that.
In your organization, let's say the hiring teams, to remove bias, you identify that we are actually going to train more people within the organization for them to be more representative, right? In terms of inclusive hiring. Okay, so that's an affirmative action. So in your plan, you detail, it's quite a long document where you detail the barriers, you detail how you're going to overcome those barriers. And you then report year on year against that same EE plan. So ultimately, the big change here, I think, is the fact that it's moving beyond the EE plan just being a 5-year document that you then shelve and you bring out at reporting time. The plan has to be a living document, and the importance of documenting, because you need to give Department of Labor the relevant documentation and evidence to say, we tried in terms of skills development, we tried to develop our people internally, we tried to recruit and we couldn't find the relevant and diverse talent. So it's moving beyond, I think, using the excuses, we can't find it. And I think another important thing that I want to speak about is the importance of talent, internal mobility of the internal talent.
What do you mean by that?
So mobility of talent refers to upward mobility, where young people and Black people within the organization do not only remain at the lower levels. How do we put in place skills development programs that actually enable that mobility? How do I, if there is a young Black individual at this certain level, and in 4 years' time we know that there's someone that's going to be retiring at a top management level, building programs to then accelerate that individual. This is what in eternal
Basic.
so it's succession.
Accommodation.
A succession planning where you plan for it and you're intentional. Where from the onset, that 4 years, that individual is on an accelerated growth path that includes management development, any soft skill that they need to learn, and acceleration in terms of maybe even projects that they're exposed to within the organization, interdepartmental exchanges, so that that individual in 4 years' time, they've got breadth and depth in terms of understanding the organization, and they're ready to then take on that leadership role.
So basically what I'm hearing from you is that you can't divorce skills development from the new employment equity amendments. So I'm trying to get like a practical understanding on like what that would look like with the succession planning really. Would that also look like, the person who's going to retire in 5 years mentoring like the young individual?
100%. So I think there's beautiful thing around the opportunity for actually even reverse mentoring. So it could be
Reverse mentoring?
yes,
What
reverse
is that?
mentoring. So it could be so the normal mentoring would be the person who's retiring is mentoring the young person that's actually going to be taking on the role in 4 years' time. But reverse mentoring is also mentoring the other way around, where young people can be mentoring older people in terms of technology or okay, so new ways of doing work, So gone is the other times where mentorship is seen one way. Reverse mentoring is actually just revolutionizing what mentorship looks like to actually say there is value in terms of what young people
Are able
pushing
to the
to a table,
yeah.
and it shouldn't just be seen that the young people are just someone who has perpetual potential that continuously needs to be developed, but they've got value to add as well. And there is value that they themselves as a mentee can actually give to the mentor.
So it's basically more of like an exchange as opposed to, being a recipient. And you touched briefly on the EE compliance certificate. Can you tell me maybe the sanctions that come with, not necessarily doing things the correct way?
So this is a real high stake because if you do not get your certificate of compliance, you actually will not be able to do business with government and state-owned entities. Some of the other realities as well is the fact that you actually won't be able to get. I'll let you have 3 minutes to restart there. I think yours.
Okay, then. All right. You can just start from the top answering the question. Yeah.
So, if you do not get a certificate of compliance and you do not meet your targets, one of the consequences is not being able to do business with and they don't entities.
Okay.
Some of the other changes, significant changes as well, that come with the amendments include stricter regulation in terms of the DG reviews. So if you are actually, you haven't met your targets, you're at the risk of then having a DG review, which automatically then has got risk in terms of fines from the Department of Labor. So there are even stricter fines that have been put in place, up to 10% of revenue that a company can be fined for not being compliant.
And I'm interested into like the financial comparative like analysis, right? So is it are the sanctions put in a place whereas like, how do I put this rather? Because I'm thinking that maybe it might cost more to invest within skills development as opposed to, getting the fines. Has that been like amended in a sense?
Not necessarily. So I think the main driver, right? I think if we look at the legislation, how the legislation is written, and what's important is for practitioners to start see the interlinkages of the legislation. So skills development, employment equity are key drivers of management control. And it's important for HR practitioners to see these elements as working together. It's important for you to make sure that the skills development team is working very closely with the employment equity team together with the overall HR team, because these two components are the true enablers. So skills development from a talent development and from a skills development point of view. And then employment equity is really just ensuring that we are building organizations that are representative of the country that we live in. And it's scientific and there's data that is attached to it.
Okay.
This will then result in the management control scorecard of the BE scorecard
Oh, yes.
actually improving.
Yeah.
So for as long as we continue to just see these as separate entities and not see it holistically as enablers of transformation across the organization, we will fail to see progress.
And in your experience, what are the differences between companies that look at skills development initiatives as an obligation versus maybe like a growth strategy?
I think it's evident when it's just done with a tick box approach.
How so?
Because what you then see are programs that are not joined and linked into the overall talent strategy. There are programs that are just done as a tick box where we've got targets to train X number of people, let's say 15 people with apprentices, learnerships, and internships. We just train those people and it's a tick box. It's not aligned to these people can actually be linked to us having a talent pipeline so that we train them and we know that the number of people that we've trained within this pool is a number that we can absorb into our business because we are building a talent pipeline. What you see with people that aren't doing it, organizations that aren't doing it as a talent pipeline, is where young people just get recycled each year. The ALIs, it's replacing, they don't get absorbed into the business. They are just a number for the BE points. Organizations that do actually do the opposite of that, where it's really enabling young people and people to really move upwardly within the organizations, is where you see that the intent from the onset is we've got programs and our programs are meaningful, our programs are quality and speak to our talent ambition. And we train young people, not just in the learnerships. We've also got leadership development programs that speak to both our criteria in terms of upward mobility within the organization. We've got executive development programs that are accredited and are quality that actually yields the result, where the aim is not we want BEV points, but the aim is we are using this framework to develop our talent, and there is benefit to us doing it this way because it's about the long-term sustainability of the organization as well. If you build talent, it's actually there's evidence shown in terms of it's way more expensive to actually hire than to retain talent. If you retain talent, it's gonna cost you. Let's say your turnover rate and your attrition rate is very high. The effort that it takes for you to replace, let's say we're losing 15% of your headcount per year.
Okay.
The effort that is going to take you and the financial effort that is going to take you to replace those people is way more than if you had retained people and they growed in the organization. This also includes things like, institutional knowledge. How do you sustain institutional knowledge if you are losing 15% of your headcount annually? It erodes the institutional knowledge. It's costly in terms of having to open these roles higher for the people to actually integrate into the organization. You probably only see actual value of someone that's been hired from outside, maybe 6 months after they've been hired, because they are taking time to adjust and assimilate into the organization. Whereas if you are actually building your talent from the ground up, imagine someone who started in an organization as an intern, let's say 10 years ago, and right now they are maybe at senior management. The knowledge that they have throughout the years of the organization compared to if you are hiring someone at that senior manager level that is, for example, an African male or female, isn't incomparable. So that is the cost in terms of beyond the financial cost of having to recruit those individuals and the cost of them actually, you getting the value of the talent. It's the loss of the institutional knowledge that this person who's been in the organization for 10 years would actually have compared to someone that is being hired from the market and doesn't have an understanding of the organization.
So maybe let me see if I'm understanding this right. So you basically say that from the ground up, there's this institutional knowledge that an individual has at a bottom position, right? And if the company invests in them correctly, skills development and everything, it's 10 years when the person stays that they have more of a return on investment as opposed to hiring externally. Am I getting it right?
100%.
Okay, I love that. I'd like us to go back to the Employment Equity Amendment Act. So one thing I want to understand is like the practical and actionable steps that, employers should be doing right now.
So what should be happening right now is, I think, one, the starting point is the employment equity analysis, so the EA12. So the analysis is what's going to give you a picture of what your gaps are compared to the new sectoral targets. Linked to that is also then the employment equity plan. So all employers right now need to be working on a 5-year employment equity plan that is aligned to the new sectoral targets. 1 September, when the reporting season starts, organizations need to be reporting based on their new employment equity plan. So as of the 1st of September this year, every organizations need to already have an employment equity plan in place. And then the subsequent steps then after the employment equity plan is the reporting, of course. Between September to January, every year is employment equity reporting season. So companies would then be reporting on the new Employment Equity Act. And the outcome of that would then be the certificate of compliance that Department of Labor would then issue. And the consequence of not having a certificate of compliance, as we've indicated, is then that you wouldn't be able to do business with government entities, for example.
From the research that I did, I saw somewhere they wrote that the Employment Equity Act is no longer voluntary, and now it's an obligation. What did they mean by that?
So previously, organizations could choose not to report.
Okay.
But the major change as well right now is the fact that any organization that employs more than 50 people is compelled to report. So it's no longer obligatory. It's mandatory that every organization that has more than 50 employees actually reports to the Department of Labor, which means they need to comply with all the requirements that have been published in terms of the new employment equity regulation.
Mm-mm. And when you look abroad, right, one thing that I found is a lot of people look at affirmative action as reverse racism, and that's maybe like one of the myths that have been associated with it. What are the common myths that you found that sort of like deter employers from continuing in this pursuit of reaching employment equity targets?
I think one of the myths, and it's an interesting one because it's as a result of the global pushback, right, with regards to DEI overall.
DEI.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Okay.
So one of the myths that you would find is that people feel that individuals and people that come in as a result of affirmative action are less qualified than an individual who isn't an affirmative action candidate. And I'm of the view that employment equity and equity within the DEI is very critical, because what that does is it ensures that the most qualifying, regardless of where you are, regardless of privilege, regardless of your background, regardless of disability, gets the opportunity. So employment equity has never been about, or affirmative action and DEI is never about compromising quality.
Okay.
Because individuals that come from those disadvantaged backgrounds best believe that they've had to jump through hoops to actually get a seat at the table. So there's no way that it would be compromised on quality. So that's one of the myths I think people really need to dispel around affirmative action. And if you speak about the reverse racism, I think in South Africa, in our context, it's an interesting context, right? Because if we look at the disparities in terms of inequality and how we continue to just be ranking the highest in terms of the Gini coefficients, in terms of the inequality in our country, it cannot continue to exist that way. And it's important that we do use the legislation, and there's often terms that are referred to as fair discrimination. So in employment equity, there is the term fair discrimination, because it is discriminating to ensure that we are correcting the imbalances from a representation point of view, to make sure that we are actually building and have in place organizations that look the way South Africa looks across all levels, not just at the lower levels.
Sort of just to like level the playing field. Absolutely. And from your point of view, what do you think the risks are that are associated with, obtaining these employment equity targets?
So the risk, I think we've spoken about, the risk of one, just not being able to do business with government entities. But I think for me, the bigger risk is the continuity of South Africa. So if we continue to have more of the same in terms of progress from an employment point of view, progress from an representation point of view, it just continues to perpetuate a system that is unjust and unequal.
And
That is the biggest risk. So that's why I think the Department of Labor is actually coming in place with this legislation that is actually now forcing corporate South Africa to actually show the relevant progress in terms of employment equity, to ensure that there is representation, whether it's people with disabilities. If we just look at people with disabilities make up about 13% of the global population.
okay.
And I guess in South Africa, we'd say it's around the same as well, around 13%. Yet in corporate and from an employment point of view, people with disabilities only represent around 1.5% of people that are actually employed in corporate South Africa. This cannot continue, because it means that out of the 13% that we spoke about,
Doesn't match the number.
it absolutely just doesn't. What happens to the bulk of the people with disabilities there who are not employed, who don't have businesses? They are locked out of opportunities. They are sitting at home, and there is ability, even with people with disabilities. They've got ability and they've got value to add in society. So it's all a mindset shift, of it's not that we can't find them, but how do we give people or designated people in designated groups opportunities for them to actually grow within the organization and have access to livelihoods.
Like basically taking them out of the rabbit hole.
Absolutely.
Completely. And just, to get your final thoughts, so one thing I did see as well is I saw that, the reason for, the Amendment Act was, transformation was happening too slow. And I guess one thing that I'd like to understand is that, like, what are we going to do differently to create, an employment equity strategy that actually has, like, longevity?
I think the key thing and the key difference that organizations need to focus on is, one, I think applying the spirit of the legislation, apply the intent, which is to build organizations, as we mentioned earlier on, that are representative of the country and not look for loopholes. I think far too often what we see when it comes to transformation and broad-based economic empowerment is interpretation, right? And people looking for loopholes.
Actually, still last week, we were speaking to someone who was once a verification analyst. He actually said something interesting. He said the loopholes aren't within the legislation, but rather within the audit process.
It's all about interpretation. And I think, again, if we apply the spirit and the intent, which is to build a country where people have got opportunities regardless of their background, regardless of their gender, regardless of their ethnicity, and with that spirit, it's then also making sure that we are putting in place quality programs.
Yeah.
And not ticking boxes, and not being about compliance, about moving beyond compliance and having a long-term view. And that's why the importance of right now, the opportunity that companies have is actually to say, over the next 5 years, do a proper, when we say an analysis, do a detailed analysis. You say, in 5 years' time, what are the opportunities at the top levels, senior management and middle management? Who are the people that are going to be retiring? And a headcount plan as well. If you are intending to grow the organization, build that into the mindset, or build it into that analysis and into the plan, so that it is something that is more long term rather than a reactive year on year, where we are just chasing compliance. It's an opportunity for this to be seen as a really strategic opportunity. And then the part about the skills development that we spoke about. So embedding programs that then enable that 5-year plan, that enable that internal mobility, that enable that succession, where it's not just a succession that we've put on paper and we've now sent it to, or we've got it filed. We do have a succession plan, but it's revisited. I always say that employment equity and the EE plan needs to be a living document. It needs to be referenced for all people movements. If you're hiring, consult the EE plan to say, at this level, if we are hiring at middle management, our plan and our analysis says the gap that we have is African female. That is then what you need to aim for in the market. If promotions come, it's referenced again. We look at the analysis to actually say, we've got 10 promotion slots at middle management and 10 promotion slots at senior management. What does the employment equity analysis tell us? And we use that to then guide us in terms of the promotions. When we've got challenges with attrition, we need to also analyze again, what is the trend from an ethnicity point of view? Are we actually solving the gap that we have from a African, let's say it's African female, which is the biggest gap? Is our attrition actually counterproductive to what we're aiming to do? Are we losing as the same population that we're aiming to actually close out? And if we are, how do you put in place programs that then address the actual challenges that are within the system?
So active development as opposed to passive.
Absolutely.
Khethiwe, thank you so much for joining us again. To our viewers, thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thank you.